The sun. Every second, it fuses 600 million tons of hydrogen, bathing the Earth in the energy that makes life possible. And although around 5.4 billion years from now, the sun will exhaust the last of its hydrogen and lose much of its mass as it dwindles into a small white dwarf star, the sun, as it appears right now, looks to be, well, invincible. And thus the Roman sun god is well named, the invincible sun, the unconquerable sun, Sol Invictus, or Sol Invictus for those of you who prefer the classical pronunciation. Every year around Christmas, Sol Invictus is brought out as an example of how Christians tried to conform their new religion to the pagan landscape of the Roman Empire. As one version of the argument goes, Sol's birthday was celebrated on December 25th, thus Christian authorities mandated that Jesus' birthday would also be celebrated on December 25th, perhaps in an effort to co-opt an already popular pagan festival day for themselves, either to directly compete against the cult of Sol Invictus, or perhaps as a conversion or proselytizing strategy. Different motivations are put forth. But does this theory hold any water? I've addressed this topic before on the channel in passing, most notably in my Saturnalia video and my Why December 25th video, but I'm aiming for this video to stand as a more thoroughgoing analysis of the Sol Invictus theory. While we do have limited evidence that the Romans marked December 25th as the birthday of Sol Invictus, this evidence indicates it was not a major festival or a particularly long-standing festival when compared to other Roman holidays. In fact, as we'll examine later in this video, our evidence that Christians started recognizing December 25th as Christmas may predate the institution of Sol Invictus's birthday by a few decades. But it's even more complicated than that. The sun probably is the reason why anyone celebrated anything on December 25th, because that's the day that the Romans marked the winter solstice, the shortest day of the year in the northern hemisphere. In this video, I will argue that the more likely reason that December 25th became a contender for Jesus' birthday was the result of Christian chronographers attempting to calculate the key moments of Jesus' life using the ambiguous and even contradictory data available to them in the Gospels. When was he conceived? When was he born? When did he die? Based on evidence dating back to the 3rd century, many Christians, especially in the Western Roman Empire, embarked on a complicated calculation spree to try to nail down these dates. For Jesus' birthday, some eventually settled on the winter solstice, December 25th, and for his conception and death, they settled on March 25th, which happened to be the vernal equinox for the Romans. This was no accident. I'm using the word calculations here, but the word contrivances might be a better word to describe what these Christians were doing. These Christian chronographers were probably motivated to align their calculations with these two dates because of their poetic cosmic symbolism. But there is no direct evidence that they calculated these dates in an attempt to copy or co-opt a pagan festival. For the pagans, the shortest day of the year in the Roman Empire also made a lot of sense for a festival for the sun god, because the days get longer and longer after that day. So the December 25th date was not so much a battle to usurp the day from the pagans, but rather evidence that there were parallel traditions tying their own god to an already significant day, the winter solstice. Note that we will not be addressing specific Christian observances like Christmas trees and gift giving, but we'll be focusing simply on the question of possible influence from a sun god festival during the Roman Empire. But with all of that out of the way, let's get into the evidence by first laying some groundwork. Who was Sol Invictus in the first place? Let's start with his iconography so you're equipped to recognize the sun god in Roman art. How did Roman artists depict Sol Invictus? We learn his appearance largely from Roman mosaics, paintings, and small finds like figurines and Roman coins. He is almost always depicted as a young male figure, usually nude except for a cloak, and at least in the Roman era, he's always beardless. The leading scholar of the Roman sun god, Stephen Hymans, definitively says in his book, "A bearded figure cannot be Sol." And indeed, we see this on countless depictions, from figurines to paintings to coins. As for headgear, he either wears a spiky crown symbolizing sun rays, or has a nimbus of light rays around his head. very apropos for a sun god, and taking a page from Greek mythology, he's frequently depicted as the driver of a 4-horse chariot called a quadriga. He's also sometimes portrayed holding a whip or a globe, other times depicted raising his right hand. As cosmic deities, the moon god frequently appears beside Sol as some sort of consort, which you can see here on screen with this late Roman amulet, which depicts the sun and moon gods side by side. And finally, Sol also sometimes appears with the god Mithras, as we'll discuss shortly. His name Sol simply is the Latin word for sun, while Invictus is an epithet, which is an adjective that expresses a quality or attribute of the sun, in this case, invincible or unconquerable. As we'll see later in this video, an earlier generation of historians tried to argue that Sol Invictus was a specific sun god, specifically an Eastern sun god from Syria or Persia. But as Stephen Hymans argues, Invictus is simply one of many Latin epithets that can be given to Sol, as well as many other deities, without fundamentally changing their identity. In fact, the epithet Invictus was used for hundreds of years for both Roman emperors and other gods. Emperors like Trajan, Commodus, and Caracalla called themselves Invictus, as were gods like Jupiter, Mars, and Apollo. There are even coins that mention Hercules Invictus. So throughout this video, I use sun god or Sol with or without his full title, Invictus, because the Romans themselves did not use the word to refer to a specific sun god or a specific sun god cult. Now, as we transition into a basic history of the Roman sun god, 3 themes will emerge. He was a relatively minor god, he was a multivalent god associated with several different deities, and our evidence for this god's veneration, the rituals performed for this god, is not as good as we'd like. None of his temples survive in the archaeological record, and our written sources rarely mention what cultic practice might have looked like. This includes any sun god festivals. Unlike Saturnalia, a Roman holiday that is very well attested in Roman literature, we have very little data describing sun god festivals. In the Greco-Roman world, people worshipped a sun god for centuries, albeit as a relatively minor god. The sun god only enjoyed major support during the later Roman Empire. For the Greeks, the sun god was Helios, and he has a long history in Greek mythology. The son of the Titans Hyperion and Theia, he is mentioned in some foundational Greek stories, including the Odyssey, as well as some of the Homeric hymns, though he remained a somewhat minor god in the Greek pantheon. Greek authors such as Pausanias do mention a few cultic centers of Helios worship, but he was outshone by gods with big pan-Hellenic sanctuaries like Apollo with his cultic center in Delphi, or Zeus with his cultic center at Olympia. Historians used to argue that the Romans simply copied the Greek Helios for their own sun god, though the experts on this topic now argue this is inaccurate. The Romans did meld some attributes of the Greek Helios, and Roman writers do equate Helios and Sol. The Emperor Julian, for example, who is called the Apostate because he tried to reinstitute traditional Roman religion during the Christianization of the Roman Empire, simply refers to the sun god as Helios in Greek, though it's pretty obvious he's referring to what Latin speakers would have called Sol Invictus, because he explicitly says Helios, nicknamed Invincible. So this is our first example of the sun god being a multivalent character. Helios in the Greek-speaking world, Sol in the Latin-speaking world. But the Romans appear to have originally worshipped some sort of native sun god. During the Roman Republic, Sol apparently was a minor god who was worshipped in tandem with the moon god Luna. The Roman writer Varro, who lived during the 2nd and 1st centuries BCE, claims that Sol was worshipped as far back as the mythical founding of Rome around the time of the legendary King Romulus. Though we shouldn't take this as historical, it might suggest that the Romans worshipped a native sun god as far back as they could remember in their history. And though the archaeological evidence for sun god cultic practice is sparse, our sources suggest that shrines and temples to Sol were built in the urban core of Rome. Tacitus, writing in the late 1st or early 2nd century, says that an old temple to Sol stood in Rome, near the chariot racing stadium called the Circus Maximus. Though it doesn't exist anymore and we have no idea what it looked like. Which leads us to the second point that I mentioned. When it comes to trying to reconstruct the ancient cult of Sol, and by cult I mean practice, the rituals people did, our sources are not that great. As Stephen Hyman's remarks in his definitive book on the subject, most of what the Romans said about the sun god consist of elite members of society writing philosophical musings, writing treatises on cosmology, astrology, and the nature of the sun. But philosophy is not ritual practice. These writers don't say much at all about how Sol Invictus was worshipped, what rituals were conducted, what festivals were celebrated. And archaeology doesn't really help because his temples and shrines have not survived to the modern day. Mostly we just have artistic representations and small finds like figurines and coins. And as I said before, things are further complicated by the fact that the sun god is often conflated with other gods, not only the Greek Helios, but also Apollo and Mithras. Apollo frequently was depicted as a solar deity, with sun rays emanating from his head. Sometimes Roman writers equated Sol with Apollo. Other times they're treated as separate deities. For example, the late Roman writer Macrobius argued that Apollo was just another name for the sun god. Mithras is also an interesting case. Now, I won't go too deep into the cult of Mithras, as I've already done another video on the topic, but briefly, the cult of Mithras was a mystery cult, a religious group that required you to go through an initiation process to join, and as the name suggests, it revolved around a Romanized version of the Persian god Mithras. No literary narratives survive from Mithraists that could tell us what they thought about the god or the god's mythological backstory. The only written texts we have are inscriptions and passing references in texts written by outsiders. But from what we can piece together from the religious iconography of Mithraism, the religion was strongly influenced by astrology and solar imagery. Mithras himself is sometimes called Sol Invictus Mithras, but a separate sun god also appears in Mithraic iconography. Mithras and Sol are portrayed in the same scene, sometimes banqueting together, sometimes riding a chariot together. So even though we don't know the myths that stand behind these images, we do know that the sun god must have played an important role in the mythology of Mithraism. Another tricky thing about Sol is that he's both a god and a cosmic symbol, obviously symbolizing the sun. In other words, the word Sol can be a proper name, referring to an anthropomorphized god, or just the word for that big shiny ball in the sky. And so Sol continues to be an ambiguous figure. A good example of this is that the sun god appears as decoration on the floors of a few late antique Jewish synagogues. The example here on screen is the Beit Alpha synagogue near Beit Shan in northern Israel. It depicts Helios galloping towards you with his 4-horse chariot. Here's another example, some footage I took at the synagogue uncovered at Sepphoris in northern Israel, located near Nazareth. A radiant sun disk sits above a 4-horse chariot, also meant to depict Helios, but in a non-anthropomorphized form. Judaism is famously monotheistic. The Hebrew Bible has the commandment, "You shall have no other gods before me," the God of Israel. It's also famously aniconic, meaning without image or without icon. Thus the commandment, "You shall make no graven images of God." So why is there a pagan god in these synagogues? Ever since these synagogues were discovered, scholars have debated this question. I tend to agree with the historian Stephen Fine, who argues that the image of Helios in these synagogues does not suggest he was venerated by late Roman Jews. The ritual context matters. He appears as floor decoration and not a sacred image within a shrine, which would indicate some form of ritual veneration. Another interesting example is the appearance of the sun god in what is probably a Christian tomb discovered in the Vatican. Even though this tomb was fairly small, it was jam-packed full of Christian art. Jonah on the east wall, the Good Shepherd on the west wall, and on the ceiling we have an image of the sun god. By any other metric, this is Sol. He's beardless, he has sun rays emanating from his head, he holds a blue globe, he is raising his right hand, and he's driving a 4-horse chariot. These are all of the same attributes that we analyzed before. Some have theorized that this is meant to represent Jesus dressed as the sun god. Thus, it's sometimes labeled as Christ Helios. Now, Stephen Hyman's, who's probably the leading expert on Sol Invictus, is very skeptical. He argues there is nothing self-evidently Christ-like about this image. It is clearly a standard depiction of the sun god, and it's put on the ceiling because, well, the sun is directionally up. I used to think that this was Christ Helios as well, but my opinion on this matter has evolved. I tend to think of this image in the same light as those synagogues now, demonstrating that Christians may not have been so squeamish about using pagan symbols, especially if those pagan symbols are removed from a cultic context like a temple or a shrine. In these examples, it's likely that Sol is not so much an object of worship as much as a personification of the sun, no more ritually significant than placing a personification of freedom on top of the US Capitol. This evidence illustrates, as Hymans argues, the sun played an ambiguous role in the Roman world, both as a cosmic body and as a god. And because of this cosmic symbolism, Christians and Jews could deal with Sol as a symbol without necessarily dealing with the pagan god Sol Invictus. So from the previous discussion, we've learned that the Roman sun god had many forms, variably equated with the Greek Helios, Apollo, or Mithras, and sometimes considered just as a cosmic symbol. We've also learned that for most of Greek and Roman history, he was a minor god, and very little evidence survives that indicates how he might have been venerated. But in order to assess the Sol Invictus Christmas theory, we need to lay a bit more groundwork, because although he was a relatively minor god for centuries, everything changed in the 3rd century because of this guy and this guy, the Roman emperors Elagabalus and Aurelian. The year is 218 CE, and a teenager by the name of Varius Avitus Bassianus ascends to the throne of the Roman Empire. By then, he had already spent some time as a priest of the Syrian sun god Elagabal, and earned the nickname Elagabalus. The cultic center of the sun god was located in the city of Emesa, now located in modern-day Homs, Syria. Now, even though Sol is frequently associated with other gods, like Apollo, Elagabal is a different sun god. As we discussed earlier, while the Roman sun god was portrayed as a nude young man with a radiant crown, this god was depicted in the form of a black stone, possibly a meteorite. The Roman writer Herodian says, "This stone is worshipped as though it were sent from heaven. On it there are some small projecting pieces and markings that are pointing out, which the people would like to believe are a rough picture of the sun." This stone is depicted on some Roman coins minted early in the reign of Elagabalus, and curiously they even depict this stone riding around in a 4-horse chariot, replacing the usual human figure of Sol Invictus. So, as his nickname suggests, Elagabalus was an ardent devotee of this Syrian sun god, and he tried to establish this god in Rome. Like we just saw, he minted new coins with Elagabal, he instituted festivals and games, and was reported to walk around dressed like a priest of the sun. But the Roman elite were not happy. The historian Dio Cassius writes that he offended Roman tradition, not in introducing a foreign god into Rome or in his exalting him in very strange ways, but in placing him even before Jupiter himself and causing himself to be voted his priest. Ultimately, his efforts failed. Elagabalus was eventually assassinated and his new sun cult fizzled. And that might have been the story of Sol if it were not for Aurelian a few decades later, who rose to power in 270 CE. Aurelian was also a devotee of the sun. According to the 4th century text Historia Augusta, Aurelian miraculously defeated Queen Zenobia of Palmyra in 272 CE. After his victory, he fulfilled a vow at a temple to our familiar friend Elagabal in Emesa, Syria. But he went a few steps further. Back in Rome, he built a new temple to the sun god, instituted a college of high-ranking priests for the sun god, and he also instituted public games to be held every 4 years, basically the sun god Olympics. We'll return to these games shortly, but for a bit of a spoiler, scholars now debate whether or not he instituted these games on December 25th. No ancient source explicitly says he instituted a holiday on December 25th, and though it's very possible, any historian that says so definitively is only inferring this rather than basing the argument on direct evidence. It's also likely he expanded an already existing sun god festival on October 19th, but we'll get back to that soon. Aurelian's story sounds familiar to that of his predecessor, Emperor Elagabalus. After all, he visited Elagabal in Syria, and historians throughout the 20th century argued that Aurelian was trying to revive the same sun god cult. The traditional argument went something like this. The Romans worshipped a relatively low-profile, native sun god called Sol Indigus, but that cult eventually fizzled out. Roman emperors such as Elagabalus and Aurelian later introduced a completely new, distinct Syrian sun god called Sol Invictus. But historians largely reject this two-sun god theory these days, thanks in large part to the work of Stephen Hymans. He argues convincingly that this theory exaggerates the effect of Elagabalus. Remember that he was resisted and finally assassinated by the Roman elites, and his efforts to introduce the Syrian Elagabal failed within 4 years. It is not plausible that his 4-year effort had any lasting effect on the religious landscape of the Roman Empire. No emperor can just flip a switch and make everyone worship a new god. Now, Aurelian definitely boosted the sun god's popularity a few decades later, but the evidence suggests that Aurelian was not trying to revive Elagabalus's efforts, but rather was just continuing a long tradition of sun god veneration in Rome that stretched back hundreds of years. Sol was already popular within the Roman military, corroborated by inscriptions of Roman soldiers fulfilling vows to Sol Invictus as far back as the 2nd century, decades before Elagabalus. And Roman emperors were stamping their coins with images of the sun god since the reign of Vespasian, basically 150 years before Elagabalus. In fact, Sol appears on Roman coinage almost annually starting from the reign of Commodus, and this practice continued all the way through Constantine's reign. During this time, Sol's iconography remains relatively unchanged. During Aurelian's reign, the sun god is portrayed anthropomorphically in the traditional Roman style, and not as a rock like what we see under Elagabalus. In other words, there is nothing particularly Syrian or Persian about Aurelian's Sol Invictus. And as I mentioned earlier in this video, an earlier generation of historians put a lot of emphasis on that epithet Invictus, saying that the native sun god was called Sol Indigus, so anytime you see the name Sol Invictus, it must be referring to the Syrian version introduced by Elagabalus. But this is simply not the case. In fact, inscriptions predating Elagabalus mention Sol Invictus, so it's a mistake to think that Invictus refers to a specific version of the Roman sun god, let alone an Eastern sun god that Elagabalus tried to introduce. So, what happened under Aurelian? Based on imperial coinage, it seems that from the reign of Trajan, the Roman sun god was associated with battles and victory, and was popular in the Roman military, and was associated with the Roman emperors. Aurelian elevated the importance of the sun god during his reign, apparently following this tradition of battle victories. Aurelian likely considered Sol Invictus to be a patron god to him personally and his family in general, and in the following decades, Sol Invictus remained closely associated with the Roman emperors, all the way through Emperor Constantine the Great. Aurelian's devotion to Sol Invictus has been misconstrued as some form of solar monotheism, but he was by no means replacing other gods. Aurelian instituted a new college of priests, which raised the social standing of the sun god cult in Roman society because it would have drawn its members from the Roman elite. But this college did not replace other colleges of priests. Case in point, on one hand, Aurelian minted coins that labeled Sol Invictus Lord of the Roman Empire. But he also minted coins around the same time that show Sol handing a globe to Mars Invictus. So he raised the profile of Sol, but this was definitively not solar monotheism. This popularity continued into the reign of Constantine the Great, who is probably most famous for showing favor to Christianity after experiencing some sort of conversion. But before turning to Christianity, Constantine was a devotee to the sun as well. According to one source, in 310 AD, 2 years before the Battle of Milvian Bridge, when Constantine rose to power, Constantine stopped at a temple of Apollo with his army and claimed that Apollo appeared to him in a vision, prophesying that Constantine would live a long life and rule the world. Now, as we've seen, Romans often associated Apollo with the sun, and even identified him as Sol Invictus, and it seems Constantine equated the two as well. And even after his conversion, Constantine continued to interpret Jesus and the Christian God through his solar theology. If you want to learn more about Constantine's conversion, I talk more about this in another video. Alright, so what does all of this have to do with celebrating Christmas on December 25th? I spent so much time laying the historical groundwork because it's really important to understand what happened before, during, and after the 3rd century. The 3rd century was a major turning point for the sun god. It was not until around 274 CE, under Emperor Aurelian, that the sun god was institutionalized in the highest levels of Roman government, and viewed as an imperial patron god. Now, as a history major in college, I'm the first to say that dates are not the most important thing about history, but I really want us to pay attention to the dates in the next section, with 274 CE as our hinge point, marking when the Roman sun god became anything more than a minor god in the Roman religious landscape. The questions that are important here are, when did Romans start marking December 25th as a birthday for Sol? How important was that festival? When did Christians start making December 25th as a birthday for Jesus? How important was Sol Invictus and his festival in making that decision? Let's start with the first two questions. Stephen Hymans strongly stresses that December 25th was neither a long-standing nor an especially important official feast day of Sol. I'm going to say that again. December 25th was not a long-standing nor an especially important official feast day of Sol Invictus. You should probably have already guessed this based on the previous historical overview. The sun god was a minor deity until the late 3rd century. We simply don't know when December 25th entered the Roman calendar as a holiday for Sol Invictus. It might have been 274 under Aurelian, and I actually think that's the case. But our clearest ancient evidence that explicitly mentions December 25th as a birthday of Sol Invictus is found in the so-called Chronograph of 354, which, as the name suggests, is a compilation of chronological texts composed or compiled in 354 CE, 80 years after Aurelian. One of the documents included in this compilation is a calendar listing the festivals that were celebrated in the Roman Empire in the mid-350s. A single line in the month of December names December 25th the Natalis Invicti, or the birthday of Invictus. And it says that on that day, 30 chariot races are to be held in celebration. The text on screen is how it appears in the calendar, a single line mostly consisting of abbreviations. The Roman numeral 8 stands for 8th day before Calends of January, or in other words, December 25th. N stands for Natalis. CM stands for Circenses Missi, 30 games ordered. It should be noted that this word Natalis is confusing. Very simply, it can be translated as birthday, but as the scholar Michel Salzman argues, it can also simply refer to a celebration to honor a god, or the anniversary of the dedication day of a god's temple. Salzman argues that this day marked the day that Emperor Aurelian dedicated his new temple to Sol in the 270s. Now, remember that she's extrapolating. This is not direct evidence, but I think it's a convincing extrapolation. So this answers our first question. When was this holiday instituted? It appears to be at least 274 CE. We have no evidence of a sun god festival held on December 25th before this calendar date. Moving to our second question, how important was this festival? What's interesting is that this same calendar mentions two additional sun god holidays. It mentions a multi-day festival for Sol celebrated from October 19th to the 22nd, called Ludi Solis, or the Games of Sol, which is to be celebrated with 36 chariot races, as well as a festival for the sun and moon on August 28th. The Ludi Solis are interesting because they coincide with an older Roman holiday on October 19th called the Armilustrium, a military festival associated with Mars when Roman soldiers arrayed themselves in the Circus Maximus, a location where we've already learned was associated with the sun god. The August 28th holiday is interesting too because according to early imperial sources, Sol's feast days were on August 8, 9, 28, and December 11th. And as you'll notice, of these dates, only August 28th is mentioned in the calendar of 354. This suggests that older festival days eventually were dropped, and the longest standing festival day for Sol Invictus appears to be August 28th. Also, as an aside, it's important to note that December 25th does not appear in this oldest evidence, and thus is probably a more recent innovation. So, looking at the calendar of 354, it's not all that clear which one of these holidays is the most important Sol Invictus festival. August 28th is the oldest, stretching back to the early centuries of the Roman Empire. The Ludi Solis are the biggest in the terms of celebrations, a multi-day festival with 36 chariot races that probably was inspired by the older Armilustrium holiday, while the birthday on December 25th sits somewhere in the middle, a single-day festival with 30 chariot races. All this to say, it's not accurate to suggest that December 25th was the Sol Invictus holiday. This source does mention it as the sun's birthday, but it was potentially overshadowed by these other holidays, particularly the multi-day festival starting on October 19th. So imagine you're a Christian living back then, and you were going to try to compete with Sol Invictus or even try to co-opt or neutralize Sol Invictus celebrations with a Jesus-themed celebration. From my perspective, there is no compelling reason from the evidence to single out December 25th when an equally big, if not bigger, festival was celebrated in October. And of course, it's worth mentioning that this calendar of 354 is a thoroughly Christian document. After all, it dates to 354 CE, decades after Constantine legalized the religion and started boosting it. This same calendar includes a list of the burial dates of Christian martyrs and bishops. The calendar also includes dates on when to celebrate Christmas and lists December 25th as Jesus' birthday. So this calendar makes me doubt that most Christians were all that threatened by pagan festivals in general or Sol in particular. So our best and clearest evidence of a supposedly very popular pagan festival, a festival so important that Christian authorities felt threatened or at least compelled to declare it the birthday of Jesus, comes from a single line in a Christian document, dating 40 years after Christianity had already been legalized in the Roman Empire. Another source that explicitly mentions a solar festival in late December is Emperor Julian, nicknamed the Apostate for his rejection of Christianity. In 362, in a text on Helios, he writes, "Before the new month, immediately after the end of the month of Kronos, we celebrate the most splendid public game in honor of Helios, the feast for Helios nicknamed Invincible." Even though this quotation is very short, it does demonstrate that Romans were still celebrating public games and feasting on a late December sun god festival, which tracks with the calendar of 354, though again, this evidence is quite late. So let's review the evidence. Aurelian boosted the sun god's importance in 274 and is said to have introduced public games. The calendar of 354 mentions 30 chariot races held in honor of Sol on December 25th. Then in 362, Emperor Julian briefly mentions public games and a feast held in late December for Helios. So returning to our first two questions, when did Romans start marking December 25th as a festival for Sol Invictus, and how important was that holiday? The answer to the first question is, we don't know, but based on this evidence, it may have been instituted under Emperor Aurelian in 274. By the 4th century, it apparently was celebrated with feasting and chariot races, and it was one of several holidays for the sun, specifically August 28th and the October Games. This is basically all we know, which means the answer to the second question, how important was this holiday, is difficult to answer. It probably was not as important as the other December holiday, Saturnalia. We have tons of evidence for this holiday, and maybe not even as popular as the other Sol Invictus festivals in August and October. The lack of evidence leads 3 leading scholars on this topic to seriously question whether the Natalis and Victi celebrations on December 25th were really so ancient, widespread, and momentous as to exert a strong influence on Christian communities in Rome and elsewhere. So let's turn to those Christian communities and their observance of December 25th. When did they settle on this date? And was Sol Invictus a factor in their decision-making? There are 2 competing theories: the history of religions theory and the calculation theory. The history of religions theory is the one that we've been addressing since the start of this video. This is the notion that Christians aimed to copy the festival or birthday of some other god, whether that be Sol Invictus or, as some fringe theorists have argued, Mithras or Horus. Neither of these latter examples are even worth addressing, as they are completely spurious. This sort of theorizing is rooted in an old way to conduct comparative religious studies called the history of religion school of thought, championed by German Protestant scholars starting in the late 1800s. At its best, the history of religion school helped to launch the modern secular study of religion, a discipline rooted in the empirical methods of the humanities and social sciences, a discipline rooted in the critical inquiry of religion that's not beholden to religious tradition or religious authority. But at its worst, the history of religion school was the academic version of this meme, drawing wild parallels between religions, whether or not the evidence really supports their claims. And these German Protestant scholars particularly focused on trying to find parallels between Christianity and traditional Roman religion, sometimes grasping at straws. To be clear, Christianity arose out of a Greco-Roman context, and many aspects of Christianity reflect this influence. An example I've covered on this channel before is notice how early artistic representations of Jesus were influenced by Greco-Roman artistic trends. Sometimes he was depicted as the standard Greco-Roman philosopher, or sometimes in the standard Greco-Roman way to depict a major god like Zeus or Serapis, with a big beard sitting on a throne. It should not surprise us to discover that Christianity was embedded in its cultural context, as is every religion. So of course we will see philosophical, artistic, and ritual influence from its Greco-Roman world, in addition to influence from Second Temple Judaism. But in the case of the Sol Invictus question, the history of religion school went too far. One of these historians was Hermann Usner, who way back in 1889 popularized the theory that Christians chose December 25th to counter or usurp the popularity of Sol Invictus. Usner cited two main sources to support his argument. First, a passage by the Syriac Christian author Bar Salibi, and an anonymous ancient Christian homily that mentions Sol Invictus. We'll examine these in order. Living in the 1100s CE, the Syriac writer Bar Salibi explicitly says, "The Lord was born in the month of January, on the day on which we celebrate Epiphany. The reason why the Church Fathers changed the feasts of January 6th and moved it to December 25th was as follows. According to festive custom, the pagans were accustomed to celebrate the feast of the rising sun on December 25th. They also let the Christians participate in these festivities, and to this day, Christians have maintained this custom." But this is not good evidence. Bar Salibi is an extremely late source. He was writing during the medieval period in the 12th century. No historian should rely on a source from the 12th century to accurately describe the 3rd century, any more than we should rely on a text from today to accurately describe the life of Bar Salibi. Basically, the same amount of time separating us from Bar Salibi separates him from Emperor Aurelian. And secondly, we should note that Bar Salibi is a hostile, biased source. Some Christians to this day celebrate Christmas on January 6th. These two competing Christmas days stretch back to antiquity. In this text, Bar Salibi, who celebrates Christmas in January, is trying to put down his fellow Christians who celebrate in December. So he has a religiously motivated interest in portraying their December 25th tradition as rooted in paganism. So in the end, Usner was simply being a bad historian by building his argument off of Bar Salibi's super late and super biased comment. The second source is more interesting. It's an ancient Christian homily that tries to calculate the important life moments of Jesus and John the Baptist. In reference to December 25th, the sermon says, "But the pagans also call this day the birthday of the Invincible One." But that's it. It does not mention anyone co-opting a holiday. It's simply evidence that Christians were aware of the day's connection with Sol Invictus, but awareness does not prove a conscious effort to copy or usurp a holiday. From my reading on the scholarship, it appears that scholars have rejected the history of religion's theory. The evidence definitely suggests that Christians were aware of December 25th as a Sol Invictus festival. Whoever wrote that homily that I just cited says that outright. But the evidence also suggests that this holiday was instituted late in Roman history, probably after Emperor Aurelian. There is no evidence that it was widespread or all that influential in Roman society, and there is no evidence that demonstrates that any Christian authority consciously attempted to co-opt the holiday. The first mention of this theory is a hostile source from the 1100s, over 800 years after Emperor Aurelian. Anyone who floats the history of religion's theory is making a speculative inference from silence rather than direct evidence. Now, I want to be clear, it's not necessarily a harebrained inference. Historians make inferences all the time. I'm inferring from the evidence that Aurelian instituted the holiday on December 25th, even though there's no direct evidence saying so. And there is evidence from throughout late antiquity that Christians co-opted pagan temples and pagan festivals. Pope Gregory the Great himself recommended this as a proselytizing strategy, writing in the early 600s. But in the case of the history of religion's theory, the theory is not as convincing than what I think is a much better supported theory. The calculation theory. This theory argues that December 25th eventually was institutionalized as the Christmas festival day because Christian chronographers engaged in complicated and even heavily contrived calculations of Jesus' life, eventually settling on December 25th. This process appears to have already been ongoing in the early 3rd century, decades before Emperor Aurelian, and rather than being influenced by pressures to counter a pagan festival, December 25th probably won out over alternate calculations because it was the traditional day of the Roman winter solstice. The winter solstice is probably why anyone celebrated anything on December 25th in the first place, pagan, Christian, or otherwise. Because the Earth is tilted on its axis by about 23.4 degrees, different parts of the planet receive different amounts of sunlight depending on the time of the year. In the northern hemisphere, the winter solstice is the shortest day of the year, when the Earth's axis is tilted furthest away from the sun, and it always occurs in December. As an aside, this means it's also the longest day of the year for those living in the southern hemisphere. But for the Roman Empire, located completely in the northern hemisphere, they marked the winter solstice in December, and traditionally, always on December 25th. We see this in several Roman sources, such as the writer Columella, as well as Pliny the Elder's Natural History. They also mark the spring equinox on March 25th, which will become important soon. What's interesting is that this was just a traditional date. Because the Julian calendar is poorly calibrated, the calendar drifts out of sync with the Earth's revolution around the sun. Even in the lifetime of Pliny and Columella, the actual solstice did not fall on December 25th. These writers were a few days off, scientifically speaking, but this was marked as the traditional symbolic day. Even hundreds of years later, the 4th century writer Servius mentions December 25th as the winter solstice, even though by then he was way off. This suggests that December 25th was deeply embedded in the Roman calendar as the winter solstice, traditionally, but not scientifically. So we can now see why the Romans might call it the birthday of the sun, because every day after that day, the days get longer and longer, more and more sunlight each day until the vernal equinox, traditionally marked on March 25th. So with these two dates in mind, let's turn now to the Christian sources. Christians became increasingly obsessed with calculating the major milestones of Jesus' story. When was Jesus conceived? When was he born? When did he die? When did he resurrect? The reason why Christians needed to engage in complex speculation is because no one knew these dates. The gospel writers did not know, or at least didn't care enough to record a birth date, but the gospels included just enough details for later Christians to attempt complicated calculations to find these dates. The Gospel of Luke, for example, mentions that Jesus was conceived during the reign of Herod the Great, born at the time Quirinius was governor of Syria, and was baptized in the 15th year of the Emperor Tiberius. Mark 15:33 mentions that darkness came over the whole land at the time of Jesus' death, so chronographers attempted to link his death to solar eclipses. And critically, the New Testament says that Jesus was crucified the day before Passover, or the 14th of Nisan on the Jewish calendar. With a firm date to work with, it's no surprise that our earliest Christian sources demonstrate that Christians attempted to calculate Jesus' death first and only later calculated his birth following from these crucifixion day calculations. But there's a catch. The Jewish calendar is a lunar solar calendar. This means it shifts around year to year on the Julian calendar. This is why holidays like Yom Kippur or Hanukkah always seem to fall on a different day year to year. So Christians needed to engage in complex calculations to try to match the 14th of Nisan to their own Julian calendar. One of the most interesting and earliest examples of such calculations were inscribed on a statue base of the Christian priest Hippolytus. Dating somewhere between 222 and 235 CE, scholars think that this records one of his earlier works. It's kind of confusing to figure out what's happening in these photographs, but it helps to think of it like an ancient Excel spreadsheet, a spreadsheet showing the Julian calendar dates that correspond to the 14th of Nisan year after year. The spreadsheet claims that in the implied year of Jesus' crucifixion, the 14th of Nisan fell on March 25th. Other Christians floated March 25th as well for Jesus' crucifixion date. Around the same time as Hippolytus in the early 200s, Tertullian also says that Jesus was crucified on March 25th. Here's where it gets interesting. Because, as we've already discussed, March 25th is the vernal equinox in the northern hemisphere. Rather than a coincidence, this is probably the result of Christian chronographers going out of their way to try to match their calculations with the vernal equinox for its cosmic significance. This leads the scholar Dr. Peter Gainsford, who blogs over at the amazing Kiwi Hellenist blog, to say maybe we shouldn't call this the calculation theory, but the concocting theory. Christians really wanted the crucifixion to align with the vernal equinox. But all of this talk is is about calculating Jesus' death date. So what about his birth date? How do we get from Easter to Christmas? Well, notice that December 25th is 9 months after March 25th. This is also probably not a coincidence. According to Jewish and later Christian tradition, prophets and saints lived perfect lives in that they were born and died on the same day. For example, the Talmud teaches that Moses was born and died on the same day. Christians apparently shifted this theory to argue that Jesus was conceived and died on the same day, March 25th, which implicated December 25th as his birthday if we calculate forward a conveniently perfect 9-month gestation period. We see this explicitly in one of St. Augustine's writings. He says, "For Jesus is believed to have been conceived on the 25th of March, upon which day also he suffered. But he was born, according to tradition, upon December the 25th. Now, admittedly, Augustine is a fairly late source for what we've been talking about thus far. We've been hanging out mostly in the 3rd century, but Augustine was writing in the late 4th and early 5th centuries. But it's likely that Hippolytus was doing a similar calculation because he landed on this pairing of March 25th and December 25th early in the 3rd century. We already know this from his spreadsheet, that he thought Jesus was crucified on March 25th. But in a commentary on the book of Daniel, Hippolytus also argues for December 25th as the birthday. Scholars for a long time thought that this was a medieval interpolation, that someone later meddled with Hippolytus's original work, but I see no good evidence to agree with this assessment. If this quotation is indeed authentic, this is our earliest evidence of a Christian marking December 25th as Jesus' birthday, a text that Hippolytus would have composed decades before Emperor Aurelian would have inaugurated a Sol Invictus festival on December 25th. But even if this quotation is a later forgery, December 25th is already heavily implied by the authentic Hippolytan table. So ironically enough, our earliest evidence that Christians landed on December 25th for Christmas predates our earliest evidence of a Sol Invictus festival. Does this flip the history of religion's theory around, that Christianity influenced the cult of Sol Invictus? Well, no. In my opinion, asking who is influencing who is a simplistic way to understand cultural phenomena like the origins of a holiday. The winter solstice and spring equinox do not belong to any particular religious tradition. They're not pagan, they're not Christian, they are natural, observable realities that were marked on the Roman calendar. Since we lack any direct evidence to conclude Christians were influenced by a sun god festival, it's more logical to assume that both pagans and Christians were motivated to associate their respective gods to a cosmologically significant day, and associate their respective gods to a cosmologically significant astral body up there in the sky. And in fact, we do have contemporary Christian documents equating Jesus to the sun. One text argues that Jesus was born on March 28th, the same supposed day that the sun was created in the book of Genesis, and links Jesus to the Son of Righteousness mentioned in the book of Malachi. The 4th century theologian Ephraim the Syrian equates Jesus to the sun as well. In the winter, it descends to a low level. In summer, like you, it ascends to the height and rules over all. As Stephen Hyman's writes, the sun's cosmic nature and reality were undeniable, and whose potential for cosmic symbolism was inspiring. Thus, Christians readily could describe Jesus with solar imagery without necessarily dealing with the pagan sun god's soul. We already saw this earlier in the video with 2 Jewish synagogues with Helios and the zodiac on their floors. Again, this is not evidence that these synagogue goers were influenced by the cultic practice of Sol Invictus, but it's definitely evidence that Jews were interested in situating their religious practice in the ebb and flow of the cosmos. We see that also with the image of Sol in that Christian tomb. So the takeaway I want to emphasize in this video is ancient history and archaeology are empirical disciplines based on empirical evidence. Of course, history is way more subjective and interpretive than the experimental sciences. In the sciences, you can conduct double-blind, repeatable experiments to prove your point. You can't really do this with history, but I often feel that this subjectivity of history gives license to people to say whatever they want without evidence. When it comes to Mithras or Horus having a birthday on December 25th, there is absolutely no evidence to work with, and you you can dismiss such claims out of hand. But the topic is definitely more complicated when it comes to Sol Invictus, because you do have a few sources to work with. You have the calendar of 354, you have the quotation from Julian the Apostate, who states public games were celebrated for Helios in late December. You also have an anonymous, probably 4th century Christian homily on the solstices and equinoxes that mentions December 25th as Sol Invictus's birthday. This evidence demonstrates that at least in the 4th century, and possibly starting in the late 3rd century under Emperor Aurelian, some Romans recognized December 25th as the birthday of the sun god, and that it was marked with some sort of festival. It's also evidence that Christians were aware of this day's association with the sun god. But is that enough evidence to support the history of religion's theory, that Christians consciously and intentionally aimed to substitute the sun god day for Jesus? I don't think this theory is supported. We don't have any Christian authority saying that they chose December 25th as Jesus' birthday to compete with Sol Invictus. Thus, it's an argument from silence. This idea does not pop up until the 1100s from a hostile Christian source named Barsalibi, who was trying to prove his January 6th Christmas as superior to the December 25th Christmas. Instead, what we do have is a wealth of documents attesting to the fact that Christians cared a lot about cosmic symbolism and calculated the major milestones of Jesus' life in such a way that places these life moments in a cosmic system, between the bookends of the spring equinox and the winter solstice. I won't say that the history of religion's theory and the calculation theory are mutually exclusive, though. I think it's possible to hypothesize some sort of hybrid theory. The Roman Empire was a huge place with millions of people, and it's very plausible that some Christian authority somewhere was very concerned about someone in his parish attending one of those chariot races in honor of Sol Invictus at the Circus Maximus. I'll admit that this is very plausible, but my point is, this scenario is hypothetical. We have no evidence that Sol Invictus was exerting all that much influence on Christian communities. From the evidence we do have, Christians cared much more about the spring equinox than they did Sol Invictus, and the Christmas date derived from this date. Much of the reason why I think Sol Invictus was not a factor in their decision-making was precisely because March 25th had nothing to do with Sol Invictus. His holidays fell on other days, and only later December 25th. The focus on the equinox and solstice, of course, illustrates that Christians were embedded in their Greco-Roman culture, but not in the sense of stealing or copying a pagan festival. The equinox and solstice were already self-evidently special on the Roman calendar, which justified attempts to tie the life of Jesus to these dates. Hey everyone, welcome to what is officially the longest Religion for Breakfast video ever made. Congratulations if you've made it this far. This video is basically my best attempt at summarizing the peer-reviewed research that you see here on your screen. If you'd like to check my research, then I really recommend that you go read these articles and books. So 2021 is actually the 7th year anniversary of Religion for Breakfast, and to celebrate 7 years, I launched a Patreon campaign to try to get to 700 patrons by the end of our 7th year. And we made it. We passed 700 patrons just a few days ago. Thank you so much for everybody that signed up, and we have 2 more weeks to go, so let's see how far we can go. Can we make it to triple sevens by the end of our 7th year? But regardless, thank you everyone who is supporting this channel. I have so many video ideas for 2022 that I'm very excited to share with you. I have a Jainism series that's currently in the works. I have a Hinduism series that I'm working on. There's a video on the Druze coming out in just a few weeks. So I'm very excited for what 2022 has in store for us. So thank you everybody for supporting this channel over the past 7 years, and I'll see you next year.